It's no secret that I'm a massive fan of the Crash Bandicoot series. Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back is the first video game I remember playing, and I've been a fan of the series ever since. I've played all of the official games with the exception of Crash Fusion and Crash Boom Bang, but from everything I've heard I don't think I'm missing much by skipping those two. Of course, having spent so much time with Crash over the years, I've developed quite a few opinions about the games and the characters and so on, and most of them are things that are generally agreed upon, like Tag Team Racing being a bad game and Wrath of Cortex having a phenomenal soundtrack and stuff like that. But I do have a handful of opinions that many a Crash fan would scoff at. This video was inspired by a video by ZCrazyG, and in it I'll go over some of my most unpopular Crash Bandicoot opinions in no particular order. I hope you'll enjoy the video, and if you do, consider leaving a like and subscribing, and I'd love to hear your unpopular Crash opinions in the comments if you have any. Oh, but before I go any further, I have to mention that some of the things I talk about in this video are related to Crash 4, and there are some spoilers, so proceed with caution. Don't say I didn't warn you. With that out the way, let's get started. I think we should kick off with something tame, just so you don't get too angry too quickly. Wrath of Cortex is often bashed for having way too many vehicle levels that aren't fun. I do agree that Wrath of Cortex has too many vehicles, and I would have preferred it if some of them weren't there at all. I'm looking at you, Submarine. But there's one vehicle I actually really like, the Atmosphere. The Atmosphere levels are so much fun. It's a simple idea, but it's done so well. The levels that use the Atmosphere are fast-paced and exciting, and are a lot of fun to race through. The controls are pretty much perfect, and the levels are designed around the Atmosphere really well. What's even better is that in Wrath of Cortex, the Atmosphere isn't a one-and-done vehicle, like the Dragonfly plane thing in That Sinking Feeling or Coco's scooter in Tsunami. It appears multiple times throughout the game, and in my opinion, the levels are great every single time it shows up. I had the biggest grin on my face when the Atmosphere made a short but badass comeback in Crash 4. It wasn't a whole level, but hey, that 2 minutes of being chased down in the Atmosphere by that truck were amazing. Since we're talking about Wrath of Cortex, I may as well move on to one of my other unpopular opinions about the game. Conceptually, I think that Crunch and the Elementals are one of the best ideas the series has ever had. Yes, you heard me. I like Crunch and the Elementals. Now granted, it wasn't executed very well, but the whole concept of Crunch Bandicoot, the Bandicoot that Cortex wanted Crash to be, as well as having him powered up by the masks of Earth, Water, Fire and Air, is such a wicked idea for a plot. I have to admit, it is a shame how poorly that idea was actually implemented, and it probably would have been better if Crunch was saved for the final boss, rather than being literally every boss in the game. And it's an even bigger shame that the Elementals were never seen again, and Crunch's character was butchered for the rest of the series, but hey, I'm not here to review the bloody games, I'm here to make you mad because of my whack opinions. With that said, let's move on to my next unpopular opinion. Now let's talk power-ups. It's kinda weird to think about, but power-ups don't actually appear all too often in Crash games. They were introduced in Crash 3, were brought back in Wrath of Cortex, much like everything else from Crash 3, and I guess they came back in Crash of the Titans and Mind of a Mutant if you count the Mojo upgrades. This might be the first opinion that rocks the boat a little. I don't like the power-ups in Crash 3 or Wrath of Cortex. I don't necessarily hate them, but for the most part I don't like what they do and I don't like how they work. I do like the double jump, it's definitely a handy tool, and the speed shoes are nice for time trials, but the rest can bugger off. The other power-ups are either broken and overpowered or completely and utterly useless. The Death Tornado Spin is the worst defender for being broken. It basically negates most of the challenge of the games. Why bother risking jumps when I can just Death Tornado Spin and glide over the pits? Why attack an enemy or try to get through an obstacle when I can just Death Tornado Spin and glide around it? And then there's the Fruit Bazooka, which is broken in a similar way. Why try and attack this enemy up close when I can just stand a mile away and shoot it with the bazooka? Why risk jumping over or running around nitro crates when I can just blow them up with the bazooka? In other words, what's the point of playing the game properly when you can just use the Death Tornado Spin and Fruit Bazooka to ignore the actual level design and make it to the end anyway? To be honest, those two power-ups are probably why people think Crash 3 is the easiest game in the trilogy. then we have the other end of the spectrum, where the power-ups are necessary for about 10 seconds of the game, or don't make any bloody difference to anything at all. That's right, I'm looking at the Tiptoe and the Super Body Slam. Everyone complains about the Tiptoe since it's only useful maybe 2 or 3 times in the Wrath of Cortex, and even to this day, after having played the Crash games hundreds of times, I cannot think of a reason why the Super Body Slam exists. It's just a slightly faster body slam that has a slightly wider range. Like, what's even the point? I much prefer how power-ups are handled in Crash 4. In Crash 4, Crash and Coco have all their necessary abilities, including the double jump, from start to finish, and the game's power-ups, the Quantum Masks, aren't permanent power-ups that you can abuse at any time. They're integrated into the level design, so the game doesn't let you slow down time with Kapunua or glide off with Akano whenever you want. The powers are only available when the game wants you to use them, and that way it doesn't make the game too easy like some of the other power-ups in the Crash series. This is definitely how I think power-ups should be handled going forward. We're starting to move into shakier territory now, but I hope you keep your pitchforks lowered for the moment. The video isn't over yet. I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about the most controversial games in the series, Crash of the Titans and Crash Mind Over Mutant. Generally, these games are viewed as abominations, and I can see why. What they did to the characters and the gameplay is as far away from what makes Crash Crash as you could possibly get. That being said though, I think fundamentally and conceptually, Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant are actually pretty solid games. If you took away the Crash label and replaced all the Crash characters with original characters, they're seriously decent games. In other words, if these games weren't Crash games, but a new franchise or IP entirely, I think they would have been well received, and maybe they would have been a success. I suppose the simplest way of putting it is Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant are good games, they're just not good Crash games, simply because it's too much of a departure from what Crash is all about. Also, side note, Crash of the Titans on DS is one of the most underrated Crash games of all time, so go play it if you haven't already. It will surprise you. Let's move on to characters. Torna, despite being a part of the series since the very beginning, is a character who has almost been entirely ignored throughout the series. She was present in Crash 1 and was never seen again until Boom Bang, but we don't talk about that game. She made a comeback in the Insane Trilogy of course, and even became a playable racer in Crash Team Racing Nitrofield, where she was finally given a personality. In Crash 4 we see Torna again, but this time she's from a different dimension. Sporting a brand new look and personality, this alternate dimension Torna is a big departure from the damsel in distress we're used to seeing. And personally, I prefer this version of Torna. She looks badass, her gameplay is badass, she's just, well, badass. Now, don't misunderstand, I like both Tornas a lot, I just have a preference for Crash 4's Torna, which I feel like many people don't have. At the very least, she's an alternate dimension character, so the Torna we're familiar with still exists. Still sort of in the theme of characters, my next unpopular opinion is about Dr. Neo Cortex. Or rather, the voice of Cortex. I will always have nostalgia for Clancy Brown's work as Cortex in the older games, and I think he did a fantastic job. But putting that nostalgia aside, I have to say that I enjoy Lex Lang's performance as Cortex a lot more. Lex Lang's bouncy and flamboyant portrayal of Cortex works so much better with the zany and cartoony world of the Crash series, especially in games like Twinsanity and Crash 4, where those Looney Tunes vibes are at their strongest. I mean, can you imagine Clancy Brown trying to do Cortex's lines in those games? I don't think the combination of the brooding and menacing voice with the ridiculous dialogue works too well. I'm grateful for the time Clancy Brown spent as Cortex, but I'm very happy with Lex Lang's portrayal, and I'm also happy that at this point, he's basically the definitive voice of Cortex. We're reaching the end of the video, so the remaining opinions are going to be real spicy, so here we go. I think Crash Team Racing Nitrofield is a better game than the original Crash Team Racing. Now hold on, don't come for my head yet, let me explain myself. I absolutely adore the original Crash Team Racing. I have a lot of nostalgia for it, as well as some childhood memories. I remember as a kid really struggling with Papu Papu's boss. I was playing as Tiny, which is a terrible idea for a beginner and a kid, but after many attempts I finally beat him, but on my way to Glacier Park, my game froze. And I didn't save. so all that time spent against Papu Papu was wasted. Despite that though, I love the game and still do to this day, but in the grand scheme of things I must say that I think Nitrofield is a better game, and the best way to experience Crash behind the wheel. Not just packed with modern visuals, the game is overflowing with content. Tracks, karts, skins and characters from Nitro Kart and Tag Team Racing, over 60 playable races with countless customization options, and not to mention the fact that the post-launch content was completely free. There's so much love and care that was put into Nitrofield, and even though the original CTR will always give me a nostalgia trip, I still think that Nitrofield is the best way to go. And if that made you angry, I might as well go all the way. I think the Insane trilogy is overall better than the original trilogy. It's a similar sort of situation with CTR and Nitrofield. Like I said at the beginning of the video, my earliest video game memories are with the original trilogy, so of course I absolutely adore them. But I just think that the Insane trilogy is overall the better package. There's of course the visual upgrade, quality of life changes like being able to save whenever you want in Crash 1, and then there's additions and tweaks to gameplay which I think improve the experience. I'm talking about things like not having to complete Crash 1 without dying to get gems, being able to play as Coco almost whenever you want, adding time trials to both Crash 1 and Crash 2, and then there's the bonus levels Stormy Ascent and Future Tense. There's so much more to do and it's so much fun to do it. The Insane trilogy is, in my opinion, the best way to experience the original trilogy. And that about wraps it up. Those are my most unpopular and controversial Crash Bandicoot opinions. I hope you're not too angry with me. I'd definitely be interested to hear which of them you agree with, and I'm also interested in hearing what your unpopular Crash opinions are in the comments. Just be nice to each other, okay?